Hello and welcome to RetireMentors. I'm your host, Jacqui Flint. And our special guest today is Dr. Jody Evans, Associate Professor of Marketing at the Melbourne Business School. Her background is in psychology, consumer behaviour and research. And we're lucky enough to get her here today to share her insights on how people make decisions about retirement. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today, Jody.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Jacqui. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm a UniSuper member, so I'm very familiar with your tools. I've used them a lot. And it's definitely made my own life better. So thank you for everything that UniSuper does do on the website to make super much easier to understand.
We always like to start with some compliments before the questions. So, speaking of research, you've done a lot of it. Is there anything really that stands out to you, I guess, when it comes to retirement decision making?
I think across the 8 years that we've been talking to retirees and people approaching retirement, the most consistent thing we hear is this sense of trepidation and fear. And most of what we found is that there are simple ways to overcome it and that it's normal. It is completely normal to feel uncertain and fearful and worried about making the wrong decisions because retirement's a big life change. And anytime we're facing change, new situations, that's going to trigger those sort of intense emotions. But what we also find in the research is when people are at their most fearful, they avoid making decisions. And this is where we've got an opportunity to make people's lives better, is helping them deal with those emotions so that they can still make really good decisions to have a great life in that later stage of life.
Now, Jody, you said there are some simple things people can do. We know people can be anxious about making decisions and, they don't know what to do, and that's super normal. What are some simple things that they could do today that will set them up well for the future?
Well, we know that fear thrives in silence, right? So you're going to feel your worst alone and at like 2 a.m, right? So you're in the dark and all of those anxieties are spiking. So the key thing is to reduce your isolation. Talk to people. Talk to people in your life. Talk to your family members and talk to people at your super fund. It's not as hard to get advice as people think it is, and it's not as expensive to get advice. A lot of the retirees we talk to in our research have big assumptions about those blockages to getting advice, and they think they don't have a big enough super balance to warrant it. There's lots of really simple tools that you can start to access. And I think one of the things to recognise as you're starting to think about retirement, at whatever age you're starting to think about it, is that it's not one decision or one moment. So it's never too early and it's never too late to start engaging. And so it's start by talking to people.
Yes, definitely. We conducted some research into how people find purpose in retirement. And as you touched on there, one of the key findings was that retirement wasn't actually a full stop. It's a journey where people might transition from full-time to part-time work. But the thing that really stood out to me was that a large number of people who participated in that study actually felt they would return to work or perhaps do something for the community after they retired. So that notion of a full stop in retirement has certainly evolved. Have you seen that come up in your research as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's many different pathways into retirement. And when that full retirement actually happens, for some people is much, much later. So we're seeing more gradual lifestyle changes. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand, that you don't just stop. You don't just stop working and stop being relevant. I think there's a lot of fear around who am I if I stop working. But certainly from our research, much like yours, we're finding that if people can, they're gradually making lifestyle changes. So maybe they're going down to 3 days a week of work, and they're going to do that for a few years before they reduce further, taking up more volunteering opportunities, taking up a lot more consulting and project work. So deciding how they want to live. I want to travel for 6 months of the year. I want to do the caravanning around Australia. And to fund that, I'm going to take up a bit more paid work at other times in the year. So I think this old notion of retirement is probably what we need to get rid of. And it's based on what we saw our parents do.
That concept that you touched on in terms of identity, and obviously you've got an academic background yourself. A lot of our members, we've got a deep history in the academic sector. I think that's particularly relevant for people in that phase, but a lot of people. And how much do you think that really plays into, I guess, in terms of that post-retirement level of satisfaction or fear or uncertainty of around, as you mentioned, who I am, not just what's in my bank balance?
Yeah, I think what came through for us in a lot of the engagement we had with people who had moved into retirement was how joyful some people were in talking about their life, because they'd really made good plans for it. They'd found opportunities to volunteer. They'd got involved with new hobbies, constantly learning, spending more time with family, finding new friends. I think that was a big revelation for us in the research, was how many people talked about finding new friends at that stage of life, and that had a big effect on well-being. But we don't want to paint too rosy a picture either. I think there's also a contrast that we find for people where retirement comes as a shock. So if you can plan it, if you're really taking control of how you want to think about the next stage of your life, you can absolutely enhance your life satisfaction and well-being. But people where retirement is forced upon them, so either through late-stage redundancy or through health issues that preclude them from working anymore, that was much harder. And that's where we've got an opportunity to support people in our community better, looking out for those where retirement has come as a shock and making sure that we've got good community mechanisms to help connect them and for them to start making those conscious choices at that point, even though they haven't planned for it.
And Jody, is it ever too early to start planning for your retirement?
I would say not. My son's 17, and so he's approaching getting his first job. And probably before I did research into retirement, I might not have had that conversation with him. And I'm so glad that I have, because the best thing you can learn at a young age is the value of compound interest, right? So putting a little bit of money in now, what that's going to mean for your life down the track, I think that's an important conversation to have with young people. But I think it's also recognising that people in their 20s, 30s and 40s are often putting most of their energy into their immediate needs. And that's important and that's absolutely valid. But just carving out, even just take one day a year. One day a year, when you're doing your taxes, is an obvious time to build it in. All right, so one day a year where you're actually going to pay attention to what's happening to your super and thinking about maybe if we just reduced one coffee a week and started to add that, what might that look like for us later in life? So where it doesn't feel like a sacrifice. But the earlier you start thinking about it, the better off you're going to be, because it's going to reduce your fear and uncertainty. So it's not just improving your financial situation, it's improving how you feel about moving into that later stage in life.
I mean, we certainly encourage our members to be curious about their super. I mean, your employer has to put up to 12% of your salary into your super, which obviously adds up over time. But there are choices that you can make along the way as well. Generally speaking, you can choose your super fund and your investments. You can choose whether to add more money, and you might even want to include insurance as well. I mean, I'm not sure that the average Australian understands quite how much power and control they have to make small choices that could really impact their retirement savings.
And that's where we see that fear shrinks your choices, right? So as soon as uncertainty is triggered and fear, we've got that kind of flight or fight response. It shrinks what you think you're in control of. And so we want to get people thinking before that uncertainty kicks in. And that's where, you've got many things that you can make choices about. But it's also recognising that choice also comes with burden, right? So if we do opt in to really making choices, then we're taking on some of that cognitive load and the emotional load that comes with decisions and fear of getting it wrong. And I think what's helpful for people to remember is that nothing is unrecoverable. That if you feel like you made the wrong call this year, you can change that next year. You can vary your investment strategy depending on your risk appetite at the time. But the worst thing to do, the very worst thing to do, is not engage. And that's what we find in the research, that people were choosing not to choose. When they felt overwhelmed, they just withdrew from making any choices at all. And the default option, it's not going to do you any harm, but you could probably do better by getting engaged.
It's really interesting because I think traditionally we might have thought people are either really engaged or don't care, not even thinking about it. So that middle ground of I want to learn and I'm trying, but actually it's all a bit too much is a really interesting space too to understand how sort of super funds or anyone in the sort of financial services industry can actually help people through that stage of sort of fear and inertia, as you say.
Yeah, I think most people we talk to wanted to get more involved in their retirement decisions and to be more proactive about managing their life towards retirement. But then they start on the website, they play with the tools, and there's so much jargon in the sector. And that jargon, that fine print, that just leads to information overload. And when people feel overloaded, what we saw happen time and time again was they just close the web browser. And so I think there is an opportunity for the sector to talk more simply, but also an opportunity for people to feel a bit more empowered when dealing with advice and their superannuation fund to ask, to say, can you explain what this would look like for my life? And I think that's where we're seeing such improvement in digital tools of really being able to tailor content so it feels meaningful for you. So it's also not being afraid to ask, to say, do better, explain it to me in language I can understand.
It's interesting you say too, because it's quite natural, I suppose, for people to want to talk to friends or families or colleagues about different things, but money can be a sensitive topic for people. Or then on the other end, you might get the sort of Dunning-Kruger effect, and people who maybe don't know as much as they think they do are giving advice. And it's sort of interesting to see how people can navigate through personal stories of people's lived experience as well as sort of professional advice as well. Do you see that people sort of gravitate towards one in a sequence, or people are either or, I want to talk to a professional or friend? How does that play out?
It often linked back to your childhood and whether your parents talked to you about money. So if you're a household where people talked about finances, you generally had much higher financial confidence and you felt more comfortable talking about it. There was no shame about it. There was no stigma about talking about money with people close to you. And that's not just talking to people for advice. That's often just talking through your own thinking. Sometimes we just have to think out loud. And that's where it's helpful to be talking to other people, not for their opinion, but as a processing tool for yourself. And so certainly there's a difference depending on whether you talk about financial situations at home. For those where finances were not talked about, they really struggle. They struggle to feel comfortable, even talking to a financial advisor. And so what we want to do, if you want to make a difference for your own kids, is definitely start talking about money early in life and being honest about financial decisions and choices and trade-offs.
Oh, I really want to touch on something that you just mentioned there around confidence. I'd love to unpack something with you. We know that the most common question people have about their super is, how much do I need to retire? You know, a really valid and obviously an important question, so it's no surprise. But I wanted to understand from you, do you think that's the most important question? Or if not, what are the other questions that they might want to ask before that one in order to start their retirement planning?
It is the number one question, right? In every single study that we have done, and we've literally talked to thousands of retirees at this point, will I have enough? Right? This language, this mental notion of enough, and enough to last. So thinking about lifespan and worried about what their financial needs might be in a future they can't even quite imagine, but also enough to live the way they want to live. And so this obsession with enough, this is really fed by the media, right? All of that reporting. So every time we get media reporting the latest estimate of how much money you need to have in retirement, you see a corresponding spike in people's fear and anxiety. What we know is there's no perfect number, right? And even people where in our research, objectively, they have significant savings for retirement, they still didn't feel like they had enough because we have this notion that we always need more. But what we found is there were a lot of people who had very high life satisfaction in retirement, living off a small superannuation balance and dependent on the pension. And they talked about really full lives of volunteering and time with friends and going for walks. And they had made really conscious decisions around how they wanted to live their life that had nothing to do with how much money they had. And so I think we are kind of starting with the wrong question about, will I have enough money? And really the starting question is, how do I want to live later? What does that life need to look like for me? And then working backwards to, well, how much money would I need to have that particular life? So I think it's about planning your life stage. It's more a design problem than a financial problem, right? Designing that next stage of your life instead of just thinking about how much is in your super balance.
I think too that idea of that fear of running out of money, I suppose. Do you see that that also extends, I guess, into the post-retirement phase? So even if, as you say, objectively a person might have, a strong balance there, but they're afraid to actually spend that money?
Yeah. I mean, it is a very strong finding that we have that people are living far more frugally than they need to. And so because they don't know, they haven't engaged with some of the tools like a calculator for their lifestyle and their lifespan. They don't know for sure. And so therefore the feelings of uncertainty drive their behaviour. And we had many forgoing heating, medical appointments, social engagements, because they were so worried about stretching their money over their lifespan. And it was once we sat them down and showed them how their wealth could be managed over time that they realised they could totally have an enjoyable life. They could find that joy in that later stage of life again. But those fears, they drive behaviours. And so we've got to address the fear and the uncertainty by increasing that sense of knowledge and control. And then you're going to see that big boost in life satisfaction.
It's interesting you mentioned health as well. It's something I'm quite passionate about, someone with health conditions. Do you find that also that fear and complexity around decision-making about super and finance also extends to other sort of super-related or super-within benefits for things like insurance? So are people sort of also in that fear of complexity and decision-making when it comes to things like that as well?
Yeah, we found that grew for people depending on the situation they were observing their parents in. And so if your parents were in good health and into later life, that anxiety wasn't there, and possibly the awareness wasn't there around things like insurance and other lifestyle choices. But if your parents were in ill health, if they were dependent on the public health care system, if there were really complex aged care needs, this spiked people's anxiety. And what we would have hoped is that by seeing their parents in that situation, they would be more proactive themselves, but we find the opposite. Again, it triggers fear, and fear means that often you remove yourself from dealing with it. And so we've got to be comfortable with those uncomfortable emotions, sitting with those emotions and using them to drive good choices and behaviour rather than avoidant behaviour.
Did you see in your research people that were either able to sort of to overcome that fear or actually had the right conditions or the right mindset to try and avoid that? Any sort of real practical tips that kind of came through as what would work for people?
So the main things that we see as a way of reducing fear is to get more educated. And that's not about general financial literacy. That's about educated about your own situation. So it's not reading lots of generic financial advice about retirement. It's getting more informed and in control about your life. What's your health situation? What does your GP suggest for you is the next 10 to 20 years going to look like? What sort of money do you have to rely on? And what choices do you want to make? So it's about taking more control. And so we see a direct correlation between those who take active control and are making choices and life satisfaction. Just more control builds confidence, reduces fear, and there we get the joy in life.
One more thing I'd be really interested to know, based on your own experience, obviously in the marketing field, but also from what you've heard through your research. As an industry, we're often our own worst enemy when it comes to the language we use. We've got pensions, we've got annuities, we've got decumulation. How much of an effect do you think that sort of language has on people's ability to actually understand what on earth we're talking about and what they need to do?
Oh, it's tremendous. I mean, the sector needs to stop using its own language with the public, right? And part of that's driven by regulation, right? So the regulator, with the best of intent to protect people, has meant that it is a very complicated, jargonistic pile of information that people have to wade through. And, you mentioned the term annuities. We've done quite a bit of research in that space, and there's so much baggage attached to the word annuity. And then you see the sector responding, and so there's lots of different ways of referring to it now. So there's the idea that, it's a salary for life, it's a lifetime income stream, it's a longevity product. Even talking about longevity versus lifespan, we just add so much formal language. And so it's entirely natural that people look at that and say, well, I don't hear myself in this language, so therefore it's not for me. And I think that's where we all as individuals can start to drive some change of asking for simpler explanations, asking for it to be explained in a way that is relevant and meaningful for you. And I think, in the space of things like annuities, thinking about it as a lifetime income, and that's an important thing to be thinking about. And Australia has a very low take-up of lifetime income products. And yet we have super high uncertainty about outliving our retirement savings. So there's a whole category of products that can help relieve that uncertainty. But the sector is just so full of jargon around it that it puts people off.
Amazing. So, Jody, what do you reckon is the most important thing that we actually haven't spoken about today yet?
I think the main message for anyone is that what you're feeling is entirely normal. It really is. You are not alone. Retirement is not all about money. It's about how you feel about yourself and how you feel about that next stage. And so this is where we need to start talking earlier. We need to start engaging with our super fund. Don't treat it as a set and forget. That's probably the most dangerous thing to do. And so really the first thing, just get online and check your super balance. Play with a calculator. Play with it many, many times. Calculators are fantastic tools, but only if you keep engaging with it. So playing with it once and getting a bit scared, that's probably not the time to stop. If you're playing with a calculator and you don't like the answers it's giving you, that's the time to start talking again and find out how can your future look better for you.
Jody, thank you so much for your time today. You've been an absolute wealth of knowledge. Now, if people wanted to get more information, whether that's about you or some of the really exciting and interesting research that you've done, where can they go to get that?
So mbs.edu is our website, and you can just look me up on that, Jody Evans.
Again, thank you so much for your time today. Until next time.
This podcast is general in nature and it doesn't take into account your financial situation, needs or objectives. So, before you make any decisions about your super, we recommend that you seek financial advice first. Also, make sure you've had a read of the product disclosure statement and the target market determination that's relevant to you. They're all available on our website.